I had always been in control, commanding boardrooms and orchestrating deals with the precision of a maestro. That's what people said about me anyway, and I'd come to believe it myself. After 30 years climbing the ranks of Manhattan's financial elite, I'd earned my reputation as Alexander Hayes, the unyielding CEO of Meridian Investments. That Tuesday evening in September, I sought refuge at Bellamy's, an upscale restaurant tucked away on East 52nd Street. It was my regular table, corner position, back to the wall, perfect for observing without being observed. The maitre d', James, knew better than to seat anyone too close. Most nights I came with clients or board members, but occasionally I needed solitude to untangle complex thoughts. "Your usual Macallan 18, Mr. Hayes?" James asked, materializing at my side with practiced timing. "Perfect, thank you," I replied, barely looking up from the quarterly projections displayed on my tablet. The amber liquid arrived moments later, and I took a measured sip, savoring the warm oak notes while reviewing acquisition figures for a promising tech startup in Boston. The restaurant hummed with the gentle symphony of Manhattan money. Hushed conversations, the clink of fine crystal, occasional bursts of restrained laughter. I was vaguely aware of the fall rain pattering against the windows, creating a cozy barrier between this sanctum of privilege and the ordinary world outside. I'd just highlighted a questionable expense report when someone, disrupted my concentration. A presence that felt out of place. Glancing up, I spotted him immediately. A boy, perhaps 10 or 11, navigating between tables with unusual purpose. He wore a gray school uniform, slightly rumpled, with a navy backpack slung over one shoulder. His chestnut hair needed a trim, falling just above intelligent eyes that scanned the dining room with surprising intensity. My first thought was practicality. Where were his parents? Bellamy's wasn't a family establishment. Children were tolerated rather than welcomed, and even then, they were expected to be immaculately behaved extensions of their wealthy guardians. Yet something about this boy arrested my attention. There was a deliberateness to his movements, a quiet determination that seemed at odds with his youth. I watched as he politely declined assistance from a concerned server, continuing his survey of the dining room until his gaze locked with mine. The recognition in his eyes was immediate, unmistakable. I, however, felt nothing but confusion as he approached my table with steady steps. My mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps he was collecting for charity, or maybe he'd mistaken me for someone else. Whatever the case, I was already formulating a polite but firm dismissal. "Excuse me," I began, my tone calibrated to be authoritative yet not unkind. "I think you may have. You're Alexander Hayes," he interrupted, his voice carrying a slight tremor beneath its confidence. "You live in the penthouse at the Sheffield on Central Park South. Your office is on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower. You like black coffee with one sugar, and you always carry a Mont Blanc pen in your left inside pocket." I felt my practiced composure falter. These were specific details, not the kind someone would know from business magazines or television appearances. My hand instinctively moved to my jacket, where indeed my pen rested in its customary place. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice dropping to ensure our conversation remained private. The boy's chin lifted slightly. "My name is Ethan. Ethan Williams." Williams. The surname sparked no immediate recognition, yet something in his steady gaze suggested I should know it. "I'm sorry, Ethan, but I don't believe we've met," I offered, though uncertainty had begun to creep into my voice. His expression flickered between disappointment and resolve. "Grandma was right," he said, his words measured and clear. "She said that you would pretend not to know me." The statement hit with unexpected force. Not accusatory, but matter of fact, as if he were simply confirming a prediction. My mind scrambled to place a grandmother, a Williams, anyone who might connect me to this composed child standing before me. "Your grandmother," I ventured carefully. "Who is she?" "Sarah Williams." He watched my face intently. "But she was Sarah Mitchell before she married Grandpa. You knew her in Chicago, before you moved to New York." Sarah Mitchell. The name crashed through my consciousness like a stone through glass. Images flashed rapid fire. A small apartment in Lincoln Park, Lake Michigan in winter, a woman's laugh on summer evenings, promises made and unmade. "That's not possible," I whispered, more to myself than to the boy. "Sarah Mitchell is My grandmother, Ethan finished. And she's dying. The restaurant's ambient noise faded to a distant hum. My carefully structured world, board meetings and balance sheets, power lunches and penthouse views, suddenly felt insubstantial, like elaborate props on a stage. She asked to see you. Ethan continued, pulling a folded note from his pocket and placing it on the table between us. She's at Mount Sinai Hospital, room 718. I stared at the paper, unable to reach for it, anchored by the weight of 3 decades of deliberate forgetting. How did you find me? I managed. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Grandma used to save newspaper articles about you. I just did some research. He shrugged, the gesture disarmingly adult on his young frame. It wasn't that hard. In that moment, I saw something of Sarah in his steady gaze, that same quiet determination that had once captivated me in a different lifetime. Before ambition and opportunity had pulled me eastward, before I'd convinced myself that some sacrifices were necessary for greatness. I should go, Ethan said, glancing at his watch. Uncle Mark is waiting outside. He doesn't know I came in. He took a step back, then paused. Grandma said you might not come. She said you probably have important meetings and things. His eyes, direct and unervingly perceptive, met mine again. But she also said you used to keep your promises. A long time ago. Then he was gone, weaving through tables toward the exit, leaving me with a folded note and the first crack in a facade I'd spent decades perfecting. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for my scotch, finding no comfort in its familiar warmth. Outside, Manhattan continued its relentless pace, taxis splashing through puddles, umbrellas bobbing along wet sidewalks, millions of lives intersecting and diverging with mechanical precision. But inside Bellamy's, at my carefully chosen table, something fundamental had shifted. My empire of numbers and influence suddenly felt hollow against the simple weight of a child's expectation and a name I had tried so hard to forget. Sarah Mitchell. After all these years, I barely remember leaving Bellamy's. James had appeared with concern etching his features, asking if everything was all right. I must have nodded, signed something, and walked out into the rain without my umbrella. The night air hit me like a physical force. For once, I didn't immediately hail a cab or call my driver. Instead, I walked aimlessly through the glistening streets, Sarah's name pulsing through my mind with each step. Sarah Mitchell, now Sarah Williams. My phone buzzed repeatedly in my pocket, likely Caroline, my executive assistant, with updates about tomorrow's board meeting. I ignored it. The rain soaked through my bespoke suit, but I barely noticed, my mind already traveling back 30 years to a different city, a different life. Chicago, 1995. I was 24, fresh out of Northwestern with an MBA and ferocious ambition. Not yet Alexander Hayes, titan of finance, just Alex. Hungry, determined, and utterly certain of my path forward. I'd landed a promising position at Weston Financial, a stepping stone that would eventually lead to New York and beyond. Sarah worked at the coffee shop near my apartment. She was studying literature at DePaul University, waiting tables to supplement her scholarship. Our first conversation had been about a book I'd been reading, something by Hemingway that I'd picked up to seem intellectual. She'd seen through my pretense immediately. "You hate it, don't you?" she'd asked, refilling my coffee with a knowing smile. I'd admitted the truth, and she'd recommended Raymond Carver instead. "Less posturing, more heart," she'd said. I'd returned the next day with a Carver collection, and our real conversation had begun. Sarah Mitchell, with her auburn hair always escaping whatever band or clip tried to contain it. Her habit of tucking a pencil behind her ear when she was thinking. Her small apartment filled with books stacked everywhere, on shelves, beside the bed, even in the bathroom. The way she'd sit cross-legged on her threadbare couch, reading passages aloud in the golden light of evening. "You're going to change the world someday, Alex," she used to say. "Just don't forget to live in it, too." I had loved her. That was the simple truth I'd buried beneath years of ambition and achievement. I had loved her courage, her clarity, her unflinching honesty. I had loved her enough to promise forever, one snowy night beside Lake Michigan when the entire world seemed to hold its breath around us. Then came the offer from Manhattan, a chance that wouldn't come twice, a trajectory that would catapult me into the financial stratosphere if I moved fast, worked relentlessly, committed completely. "Come with me," I'd urged. But Sarah was finishing her degree. Her mother was ill. Her life, her community, was in Chicago. "We can make it work long distance," she'd said. "Just for a year or two." But New York consumed me. 14-hour days became 18-hour days. Sunday phone calls became hurried texts. Promises to visit became apologies for canceled flights. The distance grew, not just in miles, but in priorities. Then Meridian happened, my first major investment success. Suddenly, I was being featured in business magazines, attending exclusive gatherings, moving in circles that made my Chicago life seem like a distant, quaint memory. One night, after 3 canceled visits and a month of minimal communication, Sarah called. I remember standing at my window overlooking Central Park, annoyed at the interruption during my preparation for a crucial meeting. "I need to know if this is still real," she'd said, her voice steady but threaded with hurt. "If we're still real." I'd hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. "I think we both know the answer," she had whispered. That was the last time we spoke. I sent her things back in a neatly packed box. I changed my number when I got a new position. I threw myself into building my empire, convincing myself that what we'd had was youthful romanticism, incompatible with the man I was becoming. Over time, I excelled at forgetting. I dated strategically, beautiful, accomplished women who enhanced my social standing and asked for nothing beyond what I was willing to give. I built Meridian Investments into a powerhouse, became the man whose calls were always returned, whose opinions shaped markets. And now, walking through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, those carefully constructed walls were crumbling. Sarah Mitchell was in New York. Sarah Mitchell was dying, and she had a grandson, Ethan, whose eyes held me accountable in a way no board member or business rival ever could. I found myself at the entrance to Central Park, where lamplight reflected in puddles and late-night joggers splashed past. My thoughts drifted to memories I hadn't permitted myself to revisit in decades. The weekend trips to Michigan's shoreline. Thanksgiving at Sarah's mother's small house, where I'd felt more at home than in the cold mansion of my childhood. The books Sarah had inscribed to me, Steinbeck, Didion, Morrison, their pages now yellowed and untouched in a box somewhere in my storage unit. Had she married soon after me? She must have, if she had a grandson Ethan's age. Had she found happiness? Had she thought of me over the years? Or had she succeeded where I had failed? And truly moving on? My phone buzzed again. This time I answered. "Alexander Hayes," I said automatically. "Mr. Hayes, it's Dr. Lena Chun from Mount Sinai Hospital. I'm calling about Sarah Williams. You're listed as her emergency contact." I stopped walking, rain streaming down my face. "That's not possible. We haven't spoken in 30 years. Dr. Chin paused. "The contact was updated recently, sir. Ms. Williams specifically requested it." I leaned against a park railing, suddenly unsteady. "How is she?" "I'm afraid her condition is terminal. Pancreatic cancer, advanced stage. She has perhaps a week, maybe less." Dr. Chin's voice was gentle but direct. "She's been asking for you. Terminal. A week or less." The clinical assessment crashed against the vibrant memory of Sarah laughing as we ran through a summer rainstorm much like this one, seeking shelter under an awning on Michigan Avenue. "Mr. Hayes? Are you there?" "Yes," I managed. "Room 718, correct?" "Yes." Surprise colored her voice. "How did you?" "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, already moving toward the street to hail a taxi. In the back of the cab, I opened the note Ethan had left. Sarah's handwriting was different, shakier, but still recognizably hers. "Alex, if you're reading this, it means Ethan found you. He's resourceful that way. Reminds me of you, actually. I know this is unexpected after all these years. I've never been one for deathbed dramatics, but there are things that need saying face to face before it's too late. No pressure, no guilt, just truth, like we used to promise. I'm in room 718. The view isn't Central Park, but it'll do." As I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my wallet. Outside the window, Manhattan's lights blurred through the rain-streaked glass. Somewhere in this vast, relentless city was the woman I had once built my future around, the future I had abandoned for the one I now inhabited. The taxi pulled up to Mount Sinai. I paid without waiting for change and entered the bright fluorescent reality of the hospital lobby, dripping rainwater onto the polished floor. The security guard eyed my sodden appearance with suspicion until I stated my destination. Room 718. I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Sarah Williams. He checked his computer, then nodded toward the elevators. As the doors closed and the car began its ascent, I caught my reflection in the polished metal. A successful man by every external measure, yet in this moment, utterly unprepared for what waited 7 floors above. The 7th floor was quieter than I expected. No rushing gurneys or urgent voices, just the soft squeak of orthopedic shoes on linoleum and the hushed conversations that fill places where life and death conduct their business. I followed the room numbers, each step feeling heavier than the last. 710, 712, 714. Outside 718, I paused. Through the partially open door, I could hear the gentle beeping of monitors and the murmur of a voice. Not Sarah's, but a man's. I knocked softly. The conversation stopped. Footsteps approached, and the door swung open to reveal a man about my age, with graying temples and tired eyes that widened in recognition. Alexander Hayes, he said, not a question, but a confirmation. His voice held neither warmth nor hostility, just weary acceptance. I nodded. I'm here to see Sarah. I know. He stepped back. I'm Mark, Sarah's brother. Of course. Uncle Mark, who had waited outside Bellamy's while Ethan delivered his message. I remembered him vaguely from Chicago. He'd been in graduate school then, studying something in the sciences. We'd met only a few times at family gatherings. She's been expecting you, Mark continued, gesturing toward the bed where a thin figure lay beneath hospital blankets. I'll give you some privacy. He brushed past me, pausing briefly at my shoulder. She doesn't have long, he said quietly. Whatever you need to say, don't wait. Then I was alone with Sarah Mitchell. No, Sarah Williams, I corrected myself. The woman in the bed seemed both achingly familiar and utterly foreign. Cancer had hollowed her cheeks and dulled the auburn hair I remembered, now streaked with silver and cropped short against her pillow. But her eyes, those were unchanged, the same deep brown that had once looked at me with such certainty and hope. Alex, she said, her voice threadbare but steady. You're soaking wet. Such a Sarah thing to say. Not, it's been 30 years, or you finally came, but a simple observation of the present moment. I looked down at my ruined suit, water still dripping onto the hospital floor. I walked for a while, I managed. After Ethan found me, a small smile lifted the corner of her mouth. He's always been determined. Gets that from his mother. I moved closer, taking the chair Mark had vacated beside her bed. Up close, I could see how illness had mapped new territories across her face. Lines of pain around her eyes, the translucent quality of her skin. Yet there was still something essentially Sarah in her steady gaze, in the way she tilted her head slightly as she considered me. You look exactly as I imagined you would, she said. Successful, distinguished. She reached for a cup of iced chips, and I handed it to her, our fingers brushing briefly. The pictures don't quite capture it. You've seen pictures of me? She nodded, taking a small iced chip. The Wall Street Journal. Forbes. Hard to miss the rise of Alexander Hayes. There was no bitterness in her voice, just simple acknowledgement. You got everything you wanted. Did I? The question rose unbidden in my mind. Sitting here, beside the woman I had once planned a life with, my achievements suddenly felt hollow. Constructs of ambition rather than genuine fulfillment. Sarah, I began, but she raised a hand to stop me. I didn't ask Ethan to find you so I could hear apologies, she said. What happened between us was 30 years ago. We both made choices. But my choice hurt you, I said, the truth I'd avoided for decades finally spoken aloud. She was quiet for a moment, considering. Yes, she finally said. It did. But that's not why you're here. I waited, watching as she gathered her strength. You're here because there's something you need to know, she continued. Something I should have told you years ago. She looked past me toward the door. Mark, is Ethan still in the cafeteria? I turned to see her brother had returned, hovering in the doorway. Yes, with Diane, he confirmed. They'll be there a while. His eyes met mine briefly before he disappeared again. Sarah exhaled slowly. Good. This should come from me first. She shifted slightly, wincing with the effort. Ethan isn't my grandson, Alex. He's my grandson. The emphasis confused me momentarily until understanding dawned like a thunderclap. You mean, he's your grandson too, she confirmed quietly. Your daughter, Rebecca, is his mother. My daughter. The words echoed in my head, impossible yet undeniable. I had a daughter. I had a daughter named Rebecca. But how? When? I stammered, my legendary composure shattered beyond recovery. I was pregnant when you left, Sarah said simply. I didn't know until after. And by then, you had made it clear what your priorities were. The room tilted around me as 3 decades of choices realigned into a new, devastating configuration. While I'd been building Meridian, attending galas, acquiring properties, I'd had a child. A daughter who had grown up, who had her own child now. I should have told you, Sarah admitted. I've questioned that decision many times over the years. But you were becoming somebody else so quickly, moving in circles so far from our life. She shrugged slightly. I convinced myself it was kinder to let you go completely. Where is she? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca, where is she now? A shadow crossed Sarah's face. She and her husband are in London. Doctors Without Borders. They're flying back, but she let the sentence trail off, both of us understanding what remained unspoken. They might not make it in time. She knows about me? Sarah nodded. I never lied to her. She grew up knowing who her father was, what you did. As she got older, she saw your name in the news sometimes. A faint smile. She has your head for numbers. Graduated from Princeton, became a physician. Princeton, my alma mater. A connection I'd never known existed. And Ethan? I asked, remembering the composed boy who had found me with such determination. He's 11. Smart as they come. Sarah's voice softened with obvious pride. Rebecca and David left him with me while they're overseas. He's been my rock through all of this. I stood abruptly, moving to the window where rain still lashed against the glass. Below, Manhattan continued its relentless pace. Taxis, pedestrians, the constant flow of a city that never paused for personal revelations. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd just learned. I have a family, I said, more to myself than to Sarah. A family I never knew. Yes, Sarah replied. And they've done just fine without Alexander Hayes, the financier. A pause. But perhaps they could know Alex, the person, if that person still exists. I turned back to face her, suddenly seeing beyond my own shock to the reality of her situation. This woman who had once been the center of my world was dying. Despite everything, my abandonment, my absence, she had reached out to offer me a connection I didn't deserve. Why tell me now? I asked. After all this time? Sarah's eyes held mine, unflinching. Because Ethan deserves to know his grandfather. Because Rebecca might need you someday, even if she doesn't think so now. She took a labored breath. And because I've carried this long enough. It's time you carried it too. The weight of her words settled over me like a mantle. I had spent decades building a fortress of wealth and influence, believing it made me invulnerable. But sitting in this sterile hospital room, faced with the life that had continued without me, I recognized the magnitude of what I had sacrificed. Not just Sarah, but a daughter I had never known. A grandson who had been brave enough to find me. I don't know how to be a grandfather, I admitted. Or a father. No one does at first, Sarah replied, her voice gentle despite everything. But you could learn, if you wanted to. If I wanted to. The simplicity of the choice stood in stark contrast to the complexity of its implications. My carefully structured world of board meetings and acquisitions suddenly seemed fragile, a house of cards built on the hollow foundation of ambition without connection. The monitors beside Sarah's bed beeped steadily, marking the precious seconds of her remaining time. Outside, the city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows. And somewhere in this hospital, a boy waited, a boy with my blood in his veins and Sarah's determination in his eyes. I'd like to meet her, I said finally. Rebecca, and I'd like to know Ethan, if they'll let me. Sarah's expression softened. It won't be easy. Rebecca has her own life, her own feelings about you. And Ethan, well, he's still figuring out who he is. She reached for my hand, her fingers cool against mine. But it's a start. A start. After 30 years of moving relentlessly forward, I was being offered not a continuation, but a beginning. A chance to know the family that had existed parallel to my rise, living lives untouched by my wealth, but shaped by my absence. I should never have left, I whispered, the truth I had buried for decades finally surfacing. Sarah squeezed my hand with surprising strength. Maybe, or maybe it had to happen this way. Maybe we all needed to become who we are before this moment could make sense. She was offering absolution I didn't deserve. Classic Sarah, finding meaning in circumstances others would only see as tragedy. Yet as I looked at her, still beautiful in her fragility, I wondered if she might be right. If perhaps this unexpected collision of our separate worlds held purpose beyond regret. "Will you stay a while?" she asked, and I heard in her voice not just the woman dying in this hospital bed, but echoes of the young woman who had once asked if I would return from New York. This time, my answer was different. "Yes," I said, settling back into the chair beside her. "I'll stay." The next morning, I woke in an unfamiliar chair, my neck stiff and my thoughts foggy. For a disorienting moment, I couldn't place myself. This wasn't my penthouse bedroom with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. Then I heard the steady beeping of monitors and remembered. The hospital, Sarah, the revelation that had tilted my world on its axis. I had stayed through the night, dozing intermittently while Sarah slept. Now, in the pale light of dawn filtering through institutional blinds, I watched her breathing, shallow but steady. She looked peaceful, the lines of pain temporarily smoothed by sleep. My phone had died hours ago. Somewhere across the city, Caroline was likely in crisis mode, trying to locate her missing CEO who had inexplicably vanished before the Thompson merger presentation. For the first time in my career, I didn't care. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Mark appeared with 2 coffee cups, offering one wordlessly. The gesture seemed both peace-offering and acknowledgement of our strange, new shared reality. "Thank you," I said, accepting the bitter hospital brew gratefully. He settled into a chair opposite me, Sarah's bed between us. "Ethan's with Diane, my wife, at our apartment," he explained. "I told him you were here. He wants to see you again." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The boy who had found me at Bellamy's was no longer just a bold child with a message, but my grandson, a living connection to a daughter I had never known. "Does he understand?" I finally asked. "About who I am to him." Mark considered the question. "He knows you're his biological grandfather." Rebecca never hid that. But knowing facts and understanding them are different things, especially for a kid. He studied me over his coffee cup. "What are your intentions here, Hayes?" The question was fair, even generous considering the circumstances. What were my intentions? 24 hours ago, my only concern had been closing the Thompson deal and finalizing my yacht purchase for summer in the Mediterranean. Now, everything felt insignificant compared to the hospital bed before me and the family connections I was only beginning to comprehend. "I don't know," I admitted. I never expected." I trailed off, uncharacteristically inarticulate. Mark's expression softened slightly. "None of us did. Sarah decided years ago you wouldn't be part of this picture. Then last month, when the doctors gave her the final prognosis, something changed." He gazed at his sleeping sister. She started talking about loose ends, about things needing to be resolved before she. He didn't finish the sentence. "I should have known," I said quietly. "I should have been there." "Would you have been?" Mark's question wasn't accusatory, just direct. The Alex I remember was pretty set on conquering Wall Street. I acknowledged. And I did. The words tasted hollow. We sat in silence, the monitors marking time with their steady rhythm. Finally, Mark spoke again. "Rebecca arrives tomorrow morning. London to JFK, then straight here." He had me carefully. "She knows you've been contacted." My heart raced at the thought of meeting my daughter, a grown woman with a life and identity completely separate from mine. "And how does she feel about that?" Mark's laugh was short and without humor. "How do you think? You're the stranger who walked away before she was born." I flinched. Laid bare in those terms, my choices seemed not just selfish but cruel. "She's coming for Sarah," Mark continued. "Not for some grand father-daughter reunion. Just so we're clear." I nodded, acknowledging both the boundary and the warning it contained. Sarah stirred then, her eyes fluttering open. She seemed momentarily confused, then focused on me with recognition that melted into a faint smile. "You stayed," she murmured. I said I would. Mark stood. "I'll let the nurse know you're awake," he said, touching his sister's hand gently before leaving. Alone with Sarah, I felt the weight of decades of unspoken words between us. But it was she who broke the silence. "There's a box," she said, her voice stronger after Mark helped her sip some water. "In my apartment. Things I've kept for Rebecca over the years." And some things of yours from before. You kept my things. I was genuinely surprised. She nodded. Not many. A few books. That ridiculous Northwestern sweatshirt you loved. Some photographs. A ghost of her old smile crossed her face. I thought Rebecca might want them someday, to understand where she came from. The idea that Sarah had preserved fragments of our life together while I had systematically erased all traces of her from mine made something twist painfully in my chest. I'd like you to go there, she continued. There's a key in my purse. She gestured to a small bag on the bedside table. The address is on my license. Look through it, Alex. See what you left behind. The request was simple, yet weighted with meaning. I nodded, unable to refuse her anything in this moment. And Alex, she added, her eyes holding mine. Call your office. I didn't bring you here to destroy what you've built. That life is still yours. Even now, she was thinking of my welfare. The realization shamed me deeply. Later, after Sarah had been seen by doctors and settled back to rest, I found myself in a yellow cab heading towards Brooklyn. Her apartment was in Park Slope, a graceful brownstone on a tree-lined street, worlds away from my sleek Manhattan penthouse. I felt conspicuously out of place in my rumpled suit as I climbed the steps and used her key. The apartment was modest but warmly furnished, bookshelves lining the walls, comfortable furniture arranged for conversation rather than appearance, photographs everywhere. I moved through the space slowly, taking in evidence of the life Sarah had built without me. There were photos of a young woman who could only be Rebecca, Sarah's features blended with mine in a face that evolved from childhood to adolescence to adulthood across dozens of frames. I saw her graduation from what must be medical school, her wedding to a handsome man with kind eyes, and multiple shots with Ethan from infancy to his current age. A family, my family, existing all these years without my knowledge. In Sarah's bedroom, I found the box she had mentioned, an old wooden chest at the foot of her bed. Inside were carefully preserved mementos, Rebecca's first shoes, school awards, letters, childhood drawings. Deeper in the box were items I recognized with a jolt of memory. My Northwestern sweatshirt, now soft with age. Books I had given Sarah, their inscriptions embarrassingly earnest. Photographs of us in happier times, young and full of promise beside Lake Michigan. At the very bottom was a small velvet box. With trembling fingers, I opened it to find the engagement ring I had given Sarah on that snowy Chicago night. A modest diamond I had saved for months to purchase, nothing like the extravagant jewelry I now bestowed casually on temporary companions. I sank onto the edge of Sarah's bed, the ring in my palm, my composure finally breaking. For the first time since my mother's funeral 20 years ago, I wept for the years lost, for the daughter who had grown up without me, for the love I had discarded in pursuit of wealth and power. How long I sat there, I couldn't say. Eventually, I gathered myself enough to do as Sarah had asked. I called my office. Caroline answered on the first ring, her voice tight with professional concern. Alexander Hayes's office, Caroline speaking. Caroline, it's me, I said, my voice rougher than usual. Mr. Hayes. Relief and frustration battled in her tone. Where have you been? The Thompson team has been waiting. The board is asking questions, and I need you to clear my schedule, I interrupted. For the next week, possibly longer. Silence then. I'm sorry. Family emergency, I said, the word strange on my tongue. When had I last used that phrase? Had I ever? Family emergency, Caroline repeated slowly. I wasn't aware you had family, Mr. Hayes. The simple observation struck me like a physical blow. Of course she wasn't aware. No one was. I had built my life around the singular I, my achievements, my wealth, my success. The idea of Alexander Hayes as part of something larger than himself didn't exist in the narrative I had constructed. Neither was I admitted. But I do. And right now, they need me. After ending the call, I moved to Sarah's living room window. Outside, Brooklyn life unfolded with its own rhythm. Children returning from school, neighbors greeting each other, an elderly couple walking slowly hand in hand. Normal life. Connected life. Everything I had systematically excluded in my climb to financial heights. I thought of Sarah, lying in that hospital bed with the grace and courage that had always defined her. I thought of Rebecca, crossing oceans to say goodbye to her mother. I thought of Ethan, brave enough to walk into Bellamy's and confront a stranger who was, by blood if nothing else, his grandfather. For 30 years, I had measured success in acquisitions and assets. I had filled my life with possessions rather than people, convinced that achievement could substitute for connection. Now, surrounded by evidence of the rich life Sarah had created, the life that should have included me, I felt the beginning of something shifting deep within me. Not regret, exactly, though there was plenty of that. Something more profound, a recognition that the man I had become was far from the man I had intended to be. That the path I had chosen with such certainty had led me not to fulfillment, but to an elegant emptiness. I carefully replaced everything in the wooden chest, except for one photograph, Sarah and me on the shores of Lake Michigan, laughing into the camera, her head on my shoulder. This I slipped into my wallet alongside the note Ethan had delivered at Bellamy's. Then I called another cab. It was time to meet my grandson properly. Mark's apartment was in a pre-war building in Brooklyn Heights, with views of the Manhattan skyline across the East River, a daily reminder of the city's grandeur and distance. As I stood outside their door, I realized I had no idea how to approach this meeting. Should I be formal? Casual? What does one say to a grandson who has existed for 11 years without your knowledge? Before I could decide, the door opened. A woman in her 40s with warm eyes and a cautious smile stood there. Diane, Mark had called her. You must be Alexander, she said. Mark called to let us know you were coming. She stepped back to let me enter. Ethan's in the kitchen. I followed her through a comfortably cluttered apartment, evidence of a life well lived in every corner. Books, musical instruments, photographs, children's artwork pinned to walls. So different from my minimalist penthouse with its carefully curated artwork chosen by interior designers. And then, sitting at a kitchen counter with a bowl of cereal and a book, was Ethan. He looked up as we entered, his expression a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Hello again, I said, stopping a respectful distance away. He studied me with that direct gaze I was coming to recognize. You want to see Grandma? Not a question, but I answered anyway. Yes, she told me about you. About your mother. Ethan nodded, absorbing this. Are you going to stay this time? The simple question, delivered with a child's devastating directness, caught me off guard. I glanced at Diane, who had busied herself making tea but was clearly monitoring our interaction. I'd like to, I said honestly. If that's okay with you and your family. Ethan considered this. Mom might be mad, he observed. She doesn't talk about you much, but when she does, she gets a certain look. I could imagine that look. The same one Sarah had worn when I'd chosen New York over her, when ambition had outweighed love. She has every right to be angry with me, I acknowledged, but I'd still like the chance to know her. And you? Ethan closed his book. I noticed it was about astronomy, and gave me his full attention. Why didn't you want to know us before? Diane stopped pretending not to listen. She turned, arms crossed, clearly interested in my answer to this fundamental question. I could have offered excuses. I could have explained that I hadn't known about them. But the truth was more complex, and somehow this moment demanded nothing less. I made choices, I said slowly, choosing my words with care. 30 years ago, I decided that success, the kind that comes with money and power, was more important than anything else. More important than your grandmother, who I loved very much. I met his steady gaze. If I had known about your mother, about you, I'd like to think I would have made different choices. But I can't be certain of that. The man I was then might still have chosen wrong. Ethan absorbed this with surprising maturity. So you picked being rich instead of being with Grandma. Yes, I admitted. And it was the biggest mistake of my life. But you are rich now, he pointed out, practical in the way children often are. I looked you up online. You have your own airplane. Despite everything, I felt a small smile tug at my lips. I do, but I've discovered that having an airplane doesn't matter much when there's nowhere important to fly to. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, not quite acceptance, but perhaps understanding. He pushed his cereal bowl away and stood. Do you want to see my telescope? He asked. It's set up in the spare room. Uncle Mark and I were looking at Jupiter's moons last night. The simple invitation felt monumental. I'd like that very much. For the next hour, Ethan showed me his collection of space books, his carefully labeled rock specimens, and his prized telescope. As he explained the difference between reflectors and refractors with the enthusiasm only an 11-year-old can muster, I found myself wondering what interests my own daughter had developed in her childhood. Had Rebecca also been fascinated by the stars? Had she inherited my head for numbers or Sarah's love of literature? These were questions I had never thought to ask, fundamental pieces of knowledge I had forfeited. My phone buzzed with messages from work throughout the afternoon, but for the first time in decades, I let them go unanswered. Instead, I listened as Ethan gradually opened up, telling me about school, his friends, and his concern for his grandmother. "She's been sick for a long time," he confided as we sat beside the telescope. "But she still reads to me almost every night at the hospital. She says stories matter more when time is tight." The wisdom in this observation, clearly Sarah's influence, struck me deeply. How many bedtime stories had I missed with my own child? How many moments of connection had I sacrificed for late meetings and international calls? When Mark returned from the hospital that evening, he seemed surprised to find Ethan and me engaged in a game of chess at the dining table. His expression was guarded but not hostile as he accepted Diane's offer of dinner. We ate together in an atmosphere of cautious civility, with Ethan serving as a natural buffer between us adults and our complicated emotions. "Rebecca's flight lands at 8:40 tomorrow morning," Mark mentioned as we finished the meal. "She'll go straight to the hospital." I nodded, my stomach tightening at the thought of meeting my daughter for the first time. "I'd like to be there, if that's acceptable." Mark and Diane exchanged glances. "That should be Rebecca's decision," Diane said gently. "Maybe you could wait somewhere nearby until she's had time with Sarah." It was a reasonable boundary, and I accepted it without argument. As I prepared to leave, Ethan approached with a small rock in his palm. "This is a piece of meteorite," he said, offering it to me. "A real one. I got it for my birthday last year. You can borrow it if you want. Grandma says holding something solid helps when everything feels wobbly." The simple gesture, a child lending a precious possession to ease an adult's distress, humbled me completely. I accepted the meteorite carefully. "Thank you, Ethan. I'll take good care of it." He nodded solemnly. "I know. You look like the careful type." That night, in my silent penthouse with its spectacular views and emptiness, I held the meteorite in my palm. This fragment of the cosmos that had traveled unimaginable distances to reach Earth, just as I was traveling the vast distance between the life I had chosen and the one I had left behind. I made calls to postpone meetings, conferring with my COO about handling the Thompson merger in my absence. I emailed my attorneys, requesting specific documents be prepared. I contacted my personal physician for an extraordinary favor. Each call was a step towards something I couldn't yet define, but felt compelled to pursue. I slept fitfully, dreaming of Sarah as she had been in Chicago, vibrant and challenging, her eyes alight with possibility. In the dream, she was reading to a small girl with my dark hair and her smile, while I stood watching from a distance, unable to step closer. Morning arrived with gray skies and gentle rain, fitting weather for the day ahead. I dressed carefully in clothes that conveyed respect without ostentation, choosing a simple suit rather than my usual bespoke armor. At the last moment, I slipped Ethan's meteorite into my pocket. The coffee shop across from Mount Sinai was busy with medical staff and visitors seeking caffeine and momentary escape. I chose a corner table with a view of the hospital entrance, ordered black coffee, and waited. At precisely 9:32, a taxi pulled up and a woman emerged, tall and slender, with Sarah's auburn hair cut in a practical bob. She wore travel-rumpled clothes and carried a weathered backpack rather than designer luggage. Even from a distance, I recognized my own features in the set of her jaw, the straight line of her nose. "Rebecca, my daughter." A stranger carrying my DNA and Sarah's determined spirit. She paid the driver and headed into the hospital without hesitation, a woman who knew exactly where she needed to be. I remained in the coffee shop, respecting the boundary Mark and Diane had established, giving her time with the mother who had raised her alone. An hour passed, then two. I ordered more coffee, declined food, and waited. My phone buzzed periodically with messages from my office, but I silenced it. Nothing there could possibly be as important as what was happening across the street. Shortly after noon, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I answered immediately. "Mr. Hayes, it's Mark. Rebecca would like to see you now." My heart raced as I crossed the street and entered the hospital. In the elevator, I touched the meteorite in my pocket, drawing comfort from its solid presence, just as Ethan had suggested. Room 718 seemed different somehow. the atmosphere charged with emotion and unspoken history. Sarah was awake, but clearly weaker than the day before, her breathing more labored. Beside her bed stood Rebecca, her posture protective, her expression guarded as I entered. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. She had my height and build, Sarah's coloring, and a presence that was entirely her own, confident and measured, the demeanor of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions. "Rebecca," I said, her name unfamiliar yet precious on my tongue. "Thank you for seeing me." She nodded once, her gaze analytical as it swept over me. "Mother insisted." Her British-tinged accent surprised me, a reminder of how thoroughly her life had developed beyond my influence. Sarah reached for her daughter's hand. "Becca," she said softly, "give us a moment." Rebecca hesitated, then leaned down to kiss her mother's forehead. "I'll be right outside." She brushed past me without another word, the scent of travel and antiseptic lingering in her wake. When the door closed, Sarah's expression softened. She's always been protective of me, even as a little girl. I moved to the chair beside her bed, noting with alarm how much weaker she seemed from yesterday. "She's remarkable," I said honestly. "You did an extraordinary job, Sarah." "Not me alone," she countered. "It was a village, Mark, Diane, my mother until she passed, friends who became family. Rebecca never lacked for love. Just for a father," I thought, the recognition sharp and painful. "She may never forgive you," Sarah continued, pragmatic as always. "You need to be prepared for that possibility." I nodded, accepting this reality. I wouldn't expect forgiveness, but I'd like the chance to know her, to be of use to her and Ethan, if they'll allow it. Sarah studied me, her gaze penetrating despite her failing strength. "You've changed." "Not enough," I admitted. "Not yet, but I'm trying." She shifted slightly, wincing with the effort. "Time's running short for me, Alex. But not for you, not for them. Whatever happens next, remember that relationships aren't built on grand gestures. They're built on showing up, day after day. Like you did," I said softly. "Like I didn't." She didn't contradict me, and her honesty was its own kind of grace. When Rebecca returned, she brought coffee for herself and me, a small olive branch I accepted gratefully. We sat on either side of Sarah's bed, the three of us together for the first and perhaps only time, united in our concern for the woman at the center. "Ethan says you're a CEO," Rebecca said eventually, breaking our awkward silence. "Yes, Meridian Investments." She nodded. "He's been researching you. He does that when he's trying to understand something complicated. He's an extraordinary child." I offered. "You and your husband must be very proud." A flicker of something, not quite warmth, but not hostility, crossed her face. "David and I are very fortunate." She hesitated, then added, "Mother says you didn't know about me." "Until now." "No," I confirmed. "But that doesn't excuse my absence. I left your mother knowing we had a relationship, a commitment. That choice set everything else in motion." Rebecca absorbed this, her expression thoughtful. "I used to imagine confronting you someday. I had speeches prepared, questions rehearsed. A small, sad smile. But now that you're here, none of it seems to matter as much as I thought it would." "What does matter?" I asked. She looked at her mother, then back to me. "Making her remaining time as peaceful as possible. Making sure Ethan feels secure. The past is just that, past." It was a doctor's pragmatism. Focus on what can be helped, not what can't be changed. I recognized the wisdom in it, even as part of me wished for the confrontation she had once imagined. Perhaps I needed the punishment more than she needed to deliver it. As afternoon faded to evening, the three of us established an uneasy truce. We spoke primarily of Sarah, sharing memories that were sometimes overlapping, sometimes from entirely different chapters of her life. Rebecca gradually revealed fragments of her childhood, her medical career, her life with David in London. I listened hungrily, collecting these details like precious gems. When Sarah drifted to sleep, Rebecca and I moved to the small waiting area down the hall. She accepted the coffee I offered from the vending machine, her exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. "The doctors say it won't be long now," she said quietly. "Days, maybe only hours." I nodded, my throat tight. "I'm sorry. For everything." She studied me over her coffee cup. "What do you want from us, Mr. Hayes?" After she's gone. The formality stung, but I understood it. "Whatever you're willing to give," I answered honestly. "A chance to know you." To be a grandfather to Ethan in whatever way seems appropriate. I have no expectations of assuming a role I haven't earned. Rebecca considered this, her expression guarded but not hostile. I'll need time to think about what that might look like, to discuss it with David. Of course, I agreed quickly. I understand. A ghost of a smile, so like Sarah's, crossed her face. No, you don't. Not yet. But maybe someday you will. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was a door left slightly ajar, and for now, that was enough. Sarah passed away on a Thursday morning, just as dawn was breaking over New York. The room was quiet except for the final, faltering beeps of the monitor and the soft sounds of grief. Rebecca held one of her mother's hands. I held the other. Mark stood at the foot of the bed with Diane, their presence a steadfast anchor in the storm of emotion. She's gone, the doctor said gently after confirming what we already knew. The world didn't stop. Traffic continued to flow along Fifth Avenue. Hospital staff moved efficiently through their routines. Somewhere in the building, a child was being born, a life beginning as Sarah's ended. The relentless cycle that waits for no one, not even billionaires who believe themselves immune to its simplest truths. The days that followed passed in a blur of arrangements and raw emotion. I stayed out of the way while Rebecca and Mark handled the details of the funeral service, offering financial support that was politely declined. I understood. They had managed without me for decades. Accepting my money now would feel like betrayal of the independence they'd built. Instead, I focused on being present in the ways I could. I spent afternoons with Ethan, listening to his stories about Sarah and answering his increasingly direct questions about my life and why I had been absent from theirs. I arranged time off for key Meridian employees who wanted to attend the service. I sat quietly in Sarah's apartment as Rebecca sorted through her mother's belongings, available if needed but careful not to intrude. The funeral was held at a small Episcopal church in Brooklyn where Sarah had been a member. I was surprised by the number of people who came, former students from her years as a literature professor, neighbors, colleagues, friends from every stage of her life. Each person had a story about Sarah's generosity, her insight, her unfailing kindness. As I listened, I realized how little I had really known of the woman she had become. Rebecca spoke beautifully, her composure remarkable as she recounted her mother's love of literature, her dedication to her students, her joy in being a grandmother to Ethan. Mark shared memories of their childhood and Sarah's unfailing support through his own life challenges. Several of Sarah's colleagues and students offered moving tributes. I sat in the back row, an observer rather than a participant, acutely aware of my status as both stranger and intimate in this gathering. When the service ended, I moved quietly to the cemetery for the burial, standing at a respectful distance as the family gathered around the grave. Later, at the reception in Mark and Diane's apartment, I watched as Rebecca moved through the rooms, accepting condolences with grace while keeping a watchful eye on Ethan. Her husband David, a tall man with a gentle manner, stayed close, his hand often resting protectively at the small of her back. She's extraordinarily strong, I observed to Mark as we stood by the window, watching Rebecca comfort one of Sarah's elderly colleagues. Always has been, he agreed. Gets that from Sarah. He sipped his coffee. And from you, I suppose. The acknowledgement, the first time anyone had directly connected Rebecca's qualities to my DNA, caught me off guard. Mark noticed my expression. Look, Hayes, I'm never going to be your biggest fan. What you did to Sarah. He shook his head. But you're here now, and Rebecca needs family more than ever, even if she won't admit it. I'd like to be part of their lives, I said carefully. If they'll have me, that's up to them. He hesitated, then added, but Sarah wanted it. At the end, she was clear about that. The knowledge that Sarah had advocated for my inclusion, even after everything, was a grace I hadn't expected and certainly hadn't earned. As the reception wound down, Rebecca approached me, David beside her. We're returning to London next week, she said. David needs to get back to his patients, and I have to report to MSF headquarters. I nodded, working to hide my disappointment. Of course they would return to their lives built entirely separate from mine. Ethan will stay with Mark and Diane to finish the school year, she continued. Then he'll join us in London for the summer. I understand, I said, though the thought of losing this tenuous connection to my newfound family was painful. I appreciate the time you've allowed me with him these past days. Rebecca exchanged a glance with her husband, some unspoken communication passing between them. David gave a slight nod of encouragement. "We thought," she said carefully, "that perhaps you might want to visit us in London once we're settled." The invitation, unexpected and tentative though it was, felt monumental. "I would like that very much," I managed, emotion tightening my throat. "And until then," David added in his thoughtful British accent, "perhaps you could spend time with Ethan here, if your schedule permits." "I'll make it permit," I said immediately. Rebecca's expression remained guarded, but something in her posture softened slightly. "He needs stability right now. Consistency. I understand. Do you?" Her gaze was direct, so like Sarah's in its unflinching honesty. "Because those haven't exactly been your strong suits, historically speaking." The assessment was fair, and I didn't dispute it. "I'm learning," I said simply, "and I'd like the chance to prove it." The following week brought significant changes. Rebecca and David returned to London after a tearful goodbye with Ethan. I established a new routine, restructuring my work schedule to allow regular time with my grandson. 3 afternoons a week, I would leave the office early to meet him after school, helping with homework or visiting museums, or simply walking through the city streets as he shared his thoughts with surprising openness. On weekends, with Mark and Diane's cautious blessing, I would take him on longer outings, to the Hayden Planetarium to feed his passion for astronomy, to baseball games where we cheered for the Mets, his choice, not mine, to the beach when spring warmed into early summer. Each interaction was a revelation, a glimpse into the family life I had never experienced. Ethan's mind worked in fascinating ways. Analytical one moment, wildly creative the next. He approached the world with genuine curiosity, asking questions I had never thought to pose. Why is the sky darker at the top than the horizon? Why do skyscrapers have different shapes? Why do some people wear business suits every day when they're so uncomfortable? This last question, posed as I collected him in my usual attire, led to my first Friday in decades spent in jeans and a sweater, walking through Central Park while Ethan explained the migration patterns of ducks with expert enthusiasm. My colleagues at Meridian noticed the change in me, not just the adjusted schedule, but a fundamental shift in perspective. Board meetings that once consumed my attention now seemed tedious when they encroached on time promised to Ethan. Investment opportunities one would have pursued aggressively were now evaluated not just for profit potential, but for ethical implications. "You're different," Caroline observed one afternoon as I prepared to leave early. "More human." I considered this assessment. "I'm trying to be," I acknowledged. The transformation wasn't seamless. Old habits reasserted themselves in moments of stress. There were days when work emergencies forced me to reschedule with Ethan, each cancellation met with understanding that somehow hurt more than disappointment would have. There were nights when I lay awake questioning whether I was capable of being the grandfather, the father my newfound family deserved. But I persevered, driven by the memory of Sarah's final advice. Relationships aren't built on grand gestures, but on showing up, day after day. 6 weeks after the funeral, I received an email from Rebecca, brief but not unfriendly, with dates for their summer visit to New York before Ethan would join them in London. She included a few photographs of their life there, their terraced house in Hampstead, David at work in his pediatric clinic, Rebecca with colleagues from Doctors Without Borders. Small windows into the world they inhabited. I responded with photographs of my own. Ethan at the Museum of Natural History, the two of us attempting to fly a kite in Brooklyn's Prospect Park, his science fair project on Jupiter's moons that had won first prize. With each exchange, the tone grew slightly warmer, slightly less formal. When Rebecca and David arrived in New York in late June, our first dinner together was awkward but not hostile. By their second week, we had established a tentative rapport, finding common ground in our shared concern for Ethan's well-being and, surprisingly, in our professional lives. Rebecca's work in international medicine occasionally overlapped with Meridian's philanthropic initiatives. "You've been good for him," Rebecca acknowledged one evening as we watched Ethan and David examine constellations through the telescope I had installed on my penthouse terrace. "He talks about you all the time in our video calls." "He's been good for me," I replied honestly. "Better than I deserve." She studied me, her expression thoughtful. Mother believed people could change. Even at the end, she maintained that fundamental optimism. "She was extraordinary," I said. "I should have recognized that 30 years ago." Rebecca nodded, accepting this belated acknowledgement without comment. After a moment, she said, David and I have been discussing Ethan's education. There's an excellent international school in London with a strong science program. He would thrive there. I agreed, hiding my disappointment at the reminder that their permanent home was across an ocean. But, she continued carefully, we've also considered that moving him immediately after losing Sarah might be too much change at once. She took a breath. We're contemplating staying in New York for a year. David has been offered a visiting position at Columbia Presbyterian, and Doctors Without Borders has a coordinating office here. Hope leapt within me, but I kept my expression measured. That sounds like a wonderful opportunity for all of you. It would mean, she added, watching me closely, that Ethan could continue seeing you regularly. If that's something you want. It is, I said firmly. Very much so. She nodded, some private decision confirmed. We'd need help finding a place to live. Schools for Ethan to consider. I can certainly help with that. I offered, already mentally cataloging possibilities. Not financially, she clarified quickly. We don't need or want your money, but your knowledge of the city would be useful. It was a boundary I respected. Of course, whatever assistance you're comfortable accepting. Later that evening, as the family prepared to return to Mark and Diane's apartment, Ethan approached me with the direct manner I had come to expect from him. Mom says we might stay in New York, he said. Because of me. Because they want what's best for you, I corrected gently. That's what good parents do. He considered this. Would you have stayed in Chicago if you had known about Mom? The question, innocent yet piercing, required complete honesty. I don't know, Ethan. I'd like to think I would have, but the man I was then made choices the man I am now regrets. He nodded, absorbing this distinction. People can change, though. Grandma always said that. Your grandmother was very wise, I said, emotion thickening my voice. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small rock, the meteorite he had loaned me months earlier. You can keep this now, he said. I think you don't feel so wobbly anymore. The simple observation, so childlike yet so profound, moved me deeply. I accepted the meteorite, this fragment of the cosmos that had traveled so far just as I had journeyed from isolation to connection. Thank you, I said. I'll keep it always. That night, alone in my penthouse that no longer felt quite so empty, I stood at the window overlooking the city I had conquered professionally while failing so completely personally. The meteorite sat on my palm, solid and real, a reminder that some journeys cross unimaginable distances, that some collisions change landscapes forever. I thought of Sarah, who had loved me enough to let me go and had been generous enough to bring me back. I thought of Rebecca, so fiercely independent, yet willing to consider a tentative place for me in her family's life. I thought of Ethan, offering wisdom and acceptance with a child's straightforward grace. My transformation was far from complete. There would be missteps and setbacks, old patterns reasserting themselves in moments of stress. The damage of 30 years could not be undone in a matter of months. But for the first time in decades, I was moving toward something rather than away, toward connection, toward family, toward the person I had always had the potential to become. Outside my window, Manhattan continued its restless dance of light and ambition. But its siren call no longer held me captive. I had discovered, through loss and unexpected redemption, that true wealth lies not in acquisitions or achievements, but in the courage to begin again, to show up, day after day, for the people who matter. As I placed the meteorite carefully on my bedside table, I made a silent promise to Sarah, to Rebecca, to Ethan, and to myself. This time, I would get it right. This time, I would stay.